now.
Dope.
Oh shit. I'll be back in a moment.
Patrick.
My wife didn't plug in the computer.
Hey folks, we're just given a few moments at the top here for Zoom to let everybody in before we get started. If you are already in tonight's webinar with us, you can open up your chat window and find some information about how to buy tonight's featured book, Fans. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Chelsea from Greenlight, and we're excited to welcome you to our online event series, Squawkin Sports, hosted by Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. For this installment, they'll be chatting with Larry Olmsted about his new book, Fans, How Watching Sports Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Understanding. So you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to our hosts, Patrick and David, and tonight's featured author, Larry, for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make this space for conversation and connection. Now, just a few housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they cannot see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and there are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. That's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with your fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Fans, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. We're excited to be able to offer actual shopping in our bookstore locations, noon to 7 p.m. every day, and you can purchase Larry's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the U.S. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Your series hosts for Squawkin Sports are Patrick Sauer and David J. Roth. Patrick has written for many large publications you've heard of and even more small ones that no longer exist. He's a founding member of the Billings, Montana to Brooklyn sports writing pipeline. David was an editor at Deadspin and is now a co-founder and co-owner at Defector.com. His writing has appeared in The New Republic, The New Yorker, Food and Wine, and The Baffler. They'll be speaking with featured author Larry Olmsted. He's an award-winning journalist who has been a visiting professor at Dartmouth College, where he taught nonfiction writing. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Real Food, Fake Food, and Getting into Guinness, a history of the Guinness Book of World Records, a book for which he broke 3 world records himself while researching. He currently writes online columns for Forbes and USA Today, and he appears regularly on television and radio. Olmsted is an avid fan of American Ninja Warrior and a passionate fan of sports fans. His new book, Fans, is a passionate reminder of how games, teams, and the communities dedicated to them are vital to our lives. This fascinating book is the perfect gift for anyone who loves sports or anyone who loves someone who loves sports. Larry is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Patrick and David and with all of you. Larry, please take it away.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I just happen to have a copy of Fans right here. So I'll just preface this really quickly by saying that Dr. Juan, who I am about to introduce, has already been introduced in the book, and he is the nation's, probably the world's leading researcher on the psychology of sports fans. He's a psychology professor. So I asked Dr. Juan what was the most interesting study he had done in his decades of fan research, and without hesitation, he started laughing. We wanted to look at fan superstitions, so we asked them to describe their sports watching beliefs and superstitions. It was really fun, but it took us 5 years to code the responses because they were all over the place and didn't easily fit into categories. But what we did learn was that people really think what they do watching at home 300 miles away affects the outcome of a game. People take this seriously and they feel guilty if they don't follow their superstitions and the team loses. A lot of it is apparel related, what they wear when they watch. Some had lucky charms, including people. Mom can't watch with us because they always lose when she's here, or we always lose when we go to the in-laws. Some of it was sex. One said, my wife has to call me Roger Clemens during sex the night before Clemens pitches. Juan and 8 colleagues representing the psychology departments of 8 universities could find only 2 other existing studies on the topic, so they did their own. Nearly 1,900 people were interviewed, and more than 40% reported at least 1 and up to 4 distinct superstitions. Many were extremely specific, such as, wear the jersey. If the Pats are losing at halftime, take it off. If I'm sitting in a certain spot and the Astros are playing well, I stay there. During games, spouse and myself must sit in our winning spots, but only for playoff games. If I eat grapefruit for breakfast, my team wins. Stand during the last out of the bottom of the 9th inning. Standing should only occur after there are 2 strikes on the batter. I always listen to every game on the radio. Even if the game is on TV, we listen to the radio and mute the TV. I have sex with nothing on but a jersey and 1 blue and yellow sock.
No one clipped that out of context.
Because they wanted to differentiate between simple rituals, such as I wear the same shirt to games because I always have, and actual, quote, superstitious behaviors believed to lead to or cause a specified outcome. I wear the same shirt because then they win. They also asked why each respondent practiced the stated behavior. However, it warrants mention that some of the superstitions described below seem rather far-fetched. This may lead one to wonder whether the participant truly believed the action could impact the outcome of the event. Yet an examination of the why responses provided strong validity for the superstitious nature of the information. For example, a University of Louisville football fan explained his food superstition: I must have nachos and a bag of peanuts to only be followed by a hot dog, by stating that on notable occasions it had affected the outcome of the game. One Dallas Stars fan's game day food consumption process was vividly detailed. At the old arena, every game I got in the Hebrew National hot dog line first. There I bought a hot dog and a bottle of water. Then I got in the popcorn chicken line. I'd eat all but 3 to 4 bites of my hot dog while in line and then wrap the rest up for my seat. At the first intermission, I got chocolate yogurt with M&Ms. At the new arena, I replaced both the hot dog and popcorn chicken with a chicken tender basket. Why this particular game time diet, we asked? I want the Stars to win and I'm doing my part. Dr. Juan's favorite, his quote, one Notre Dame fan told us that he had to drink 3 beers just before the start of every quarter. For those of you not keeping score at home, that's a lot of chugging and a 12-pack per game. One Notre Dame fan told us that he had to read 3 Bible passages before each game. What was amazing to me was that it was the same fan. I have this image burned in my memory of the guy watching with a beer in one hand and a Bible in the other. This particular line of investigation also revealed perhaps the best reason ever for not participating in sports psychology studies. Quote, if I tell you my game day rituals, my team will undoubtedly lose.
You found the coolest Notre Dame fan ever.
Yeah. This is honestly, like, for all the important discoveries in this book, finding out that there's one Notre Dame fan that's fun to party with is like maybe the most remarkable finding.
I also like the idea of like a funnel, but he's also on his knees praying. It's a kind of a simultaneous the kickoff's coming. So
they should have done one of those. They should have done an illustration of that for the book.
Yeah, I was thinking of one of those, like, those children's statues where it's like little kids are playing soccer and like Jesus is with them helping them. But in this case, it's this guy shotgunning a beer and he's right there.
Touchdown Jesus with a St. Ides and a Bible.
Yeah.
I actually, we've never done this before. I would like to start a conversation with an anecdote that I think will set the tone. So when Best American Sports Writing had an anthology that came out in 20th Century Best Writing, and they had a huge anthology that came out, I guess, in 99 or 2000, and they had a little panel discussion, not little, at Union Square, Manhattan, Barnes & Noble. It was hosted by Ira Burkow, and the panelists were Dick Schaap, Gay Talese, David Halberstam, and George Plimpton. So some heavyweights. I expected the scissors lift with like Breslin and Wolf banging on the. But somebody asked about sports fans. I don't remember what Dick Schaap said. Gay Talese was very dismissive in that sort of persnickety, condescending, like, why would I care about the fans? They're not doing anything. And then Halberstam, in his stentorian Sam the Eagle voice, told a relatively serious story about being, I don't know if it was the Spike Lee, Reggie Miller game, but it was a Knicks Pacers playoff game, and he was sitting near Reggie Miller's wife, who was taking a lot of verbal abuse, and he was like, it was getting uglier and uglier, and they said some awful things, and I was actually scared for her safety. And then of course he took it back to when fans were civilized and wore hats and that way. And then Plimpton comes up and he just starts laughing, and he tells this stem winder of a story that involved, he had season tickets for the Rangers in the fancy seats, but yet he also bought a ticket in the blue seats, so he would go up to the blue seats. And one time he brought the supermodel Carol Alt up there because she was dating a player, and they bought hot dogs and beer for everybody. And then Carol Alt started coming up to the stands, and they would chant her name, and they had this ongoing Carol Alt in the blue seats with George Plimpton and all these working class fans. And he said it was just the best party, and he laughed, and his story was the total opposite of the Halberstam story. And that stuck with me for a long time. So I remember, like, it's very easy to be jaded about sports fans. And I would say that's probably, I think I mentioned it. I worked in the 700 level Veteran Stadium.
Things.
Generally, it is very easy to be jaded. But I remember George Plimpton's story, and I was like, yeah, also I've been to 100 games that were fun as hell, and that story's great. And he was the only one who wasn't like, yeah, fans suck. Well, of course they do. And he had the story. The reason I say that is that's kind of the core of this book. Like, the part of fandom that is easy to dismiss is not all or even most of fandom. And what brought you to want to understand that? Or did you have that idea going in? What was your notion going in? Because you say in the book, you're some diehard sports guy per se. So what brought you to want to understand, and were you surprised that you found out that sports fandom has a lot of positive attributes?
Well, so after your story, this is going to sound like we set this up, but we didn't, because you don't know the answer to this question because it's not in the book. But it's very much on key with what you just said. So I came to this from the opposite perspective. Several years ago, I went to a Red Sox-Yankees game at Fenway Park in Boston. And I saw this couple that had two young children. Like, I don't have kids, so I'm not a great judge of age, but like 5 and 7-ish, young kids.
I like that admission, though. I'm not a good judge of age.
Yeah.
Maybe 5, maybe 14. I don't know.
Whatever. You didn't have to pay for their college yet.
Some 10, and they were wearing T-shirts that were obscene and homophobic and directed at the Yankees. So leave it at that. And I was like, what's wrong with these people? You know, and I mean, my mind starts doing these computations, like these kids are too young to even have allowance or paper routes, right? And they don't know what this stuff means. They could not have bought these shirts, right? The parents chose. And then I started thinking, well, they don't even sell these shirts at the gift shop, right? So the parents had to like gray market this, right? So this really sort of obsessed me and bothered me. And I thought about it for days after the game. And then I decided like, hey, maybe there's a book here, right? Maybe watching sports makes us crazy, you know? And I started to research that proposition. And as soon as I dove into the data, I saw that completely the opposite was true, that it's overwhelmingly beneficial and good for us. And I've since come to realize that there were like 45,000 other people at that game who I don't remember and didn't notice and didn't bother me. And because they're normal, well-adjusted, fun-loving people. And what I've come to realize, I mean, most people are, more than half of Americans, more than half of the world's population are sports fans, right? Almost 200 million people in this country. And, you know, some people are assholes. So when you have 200 million people, most people, you're going to have some bad apples in there, which is why the media can always find examples of like that person at the game. One of the sports psychologists told me, you know, if 1% of the people who go to the game are, you know, fans who take it too far, and there's 50,000 people, that's 500 people in the stadium. And so when you're in that, you know, sitting there at the game, there's some guy 20 rows down, standing, drunk, screaming next to little kids. And you're like, what's wrong with him? That stands out to you, but he's the only one you can see. You know, so most sports fans are not bad people, is my conclusion.
Again, I feel like Patrick's got to address the whole veteran stadium thing now.
Well, no, it's funny because
what if all of the assholes that Larry was talking about sat in the same section?
Well, there's two things. I do think there's actually been a change from, I guess, I didn't go to professional sports until I went to college. So in the late 80s. And it was cheaper, and there was more, especially in Milwaukee. There was a lot of just people shithouse drunk. I don't see that much anymore. I don't know if that's a price thing or whatever. But even at the Veterans Stadium, the Sunday afternoon crowd, because it was only still $35 a football game, so you get season tickets for $350. The 1 o'clock Sunday crowd was great. There was a lot of like veterans. It was a pretty mixed race thing, and they were fine. And, you know, there'd be, like you said, a Monday night game against Dallas in that time, that was very bad. It was you could bring too many of them together. But I think it's kind of a salient point that comes to the book. Like, you forget sports fandom is not also just going to the game, and, you know, the Bills Mafia, who they might be nice people. I don't know. It's a lot bigger than that. Like, I go to a lot of Mets games a year, which is like 6.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's fascinating. Sports fandom, you have to think of it, if you think of it as a much bigger thing than, just the guys that you see who are like, that guy sucks.
And going to the game is certainly an important experience, but the vast majority of sports fans consume their sports on TV. You know that. Yeah, so you know,
and
a lot of
them
them
seem happy to accelerate that trend to the extent that they, you know, can possibly do it too.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of younger fans maybe never go to games.
Yeah, or people that live far. I mean, this is like, you know, the way that, especially with professional sports and stuff, that, like, you know, knowing that there's like really hardcore Braves fans that don't live in the state of Georgia, but it's just like, that's the closest they've got, you know, and so they have that identity as part of it. That was part of it. So to me, like, I found the arguments in the book very interesting, and I started too from, I guess, kind of like a slightly arch perspective on it too. Just that, like, so many times in my life as a Mets fan, I have, like, just as and, you know, I cheered for the New Jersey Nets growing up. Like, I've mostly cheered for crappy teams pretty much on purpose, I think. That, like, I've often asked myself, like, what are you getting out of this? Like, why are you choosing to, like, be sad when this obviously overmatched team, like, loses a game that they're obviously going to lose? And I think that, like, that a lot of it is that, you know, like, I get frustrated because I'm not getting what I want. And yet I think that what sort of emerges through this is that, like, the part of it that works for people, the part of it that, like, you cite all of these studies where people are talking about how much more engaged and, like, just, like, mentally healthy in the sense that they're using more of their brains, like, more stuff is going on with it. Sports fans are than non-fans are. And that made sense to me in a way that I think I hadn't really like considered before. That there's like an element of like storytelling, wish casting, speculating, prognosticating, you know, going back over the bad things that happened to you, any of that, that like I don't do about anything else. And I think that like that there's something much more active about it than I think I had maybe given it credit for. Like not just in terms of like going to a game and like getting mad or being, you know, happy, but in terms of like the amount of time that I'm just kind of when my brain's otherwise in energy saver mode and I'm just thinking about the shit. Like what part of the element of like I was wondering for people who haven't read the book yet, the bit about like what fandom does to improve mental health, like and like not just like in terms of being happy, but in terms of like your brain working better
and physical health, which
that one
surprising also.
Get to that, I guess. Maybe we won't have enough time, but like tell me a little bit about the process of discovering that, Larry, especially given now that we know that you came in being like, what the hell is this doing to us? And then you're suddenly like, oh, wow, like this would all be worse.
Well, I mean, it is sort of what it's a little bit of two different things. So there is the happiness part of mental health, and the scientists or the psychologists have identified about 24 different attributes that sports fans enjoy better than non-sports fans. Things like having lower rates of depression and higher self-esteem and more satisfaction with their social life. But all of those really stem from the same thing, which is a sense of community that you get from being a fan of a team. And, you know, you're a Mets fan and you watch the game on TV and maybe you're alone, but, and this is a thing people don't really think about, but it's kind of obvious when you do, is you're not really ever watching a baseball game or a football game. You're watching a stadium, an arena full of people, mostly fans and a handful of players, and the fans are always in full view. But if you're like a Star Wars fan, which I am too, you know, I sit at home and I watch a Star Wars movie by myself on the couch. I know I'm watching a movie alone and I don't see other people watching it. I don't feel that, but you do as a sports fan. Sports fans feel, even when they're alone, like they're part of the action because they're constantly seeing 40, 50, 60,000 people in, you know, Mets or Jets or whatever jerseys. It's unavoidable. It's also unavoidable outside of the stadium because you walk down the supermarket aisle and you've got a Mets cap on and you see somebody else with a Mets shirt and you kind of make eye contact. And, you know, one of the executives I talked to in the book calls this the head nod in the sports industry. And you're connected, and it doesn't matter race, religion, age, education, political view, income. You're Mets fans, that's it, right? But and the same thing would happen if you were a Metallica fan and you wore your Metallica shirt and saw somebody else wearing it, but that just doesn't happen nearly as much with things other than sports. And it never happens with things other than sports on bumper stickers. This is something I've been like fascinated with. You see sports bumper stickers all over the place. My next door neighbor, I live in Vermont, my next door neighbor has a Patriots and a Red Sox bumper sticker on his pickup truck. But I never see a Star Wars bumper sticker. I've never seen one. I've seen thousands of sports bumper stickers, right? So you're reinforced all the time at the game, not at the game, in the newspaper. The thickest section is the sports section, you know, all the time that you're part of this group of like-minded Mets fans or whatever fans. And we're human. It's in our DNA. We're tribal creatures ever since, you know, caveman times. We want to band together in groups and form societies and tribes. So being a fan brings us that much needed sense of belonging to something, and you don't have to pay a membership fee or pass a test or get references, you know, to become a fan. So it's accessible, it's democratic. That's a lot of the mental health happiness comes from that belonging. Then there's the mental health, the like actual healthy brain part you're talking about, the exercise. And that is not as clear cut. I mean, it definitely comes from sports, but you can get that from other things. I've come to look at it as like watching sports avidly is the equivalent of doing Sudoku or crossword puzzles every day. We know it's, you know, well documented that keeping your brain active and doing challenging exercises is good for your brain, especially as you age, prevents cognitive decline. And, you know, I talked to, you know, some people in the book who said, you know, my grandfather can remember the lineup from like, you know, the baseball game that was 60 years ago. So you do get that from sports, and they've done a variety of testing, you know, doing MRI imaging of people's brains while they watch sports, different kinds of ways of watching what your brain actually does. And the results are always that your brain is surprisingly active when you're watching sports, and that's good for you. But that sports isn't the only thing you can get that from. The way the sense of community is more exclusive.
But there is a universal thing that there are people who, if I ask them to explain how, basic, how a bill becomes a law, even what the basic forms of government are, who have beliefs that I just I can't even fathom how it got there. QAnon, who can also explain the cover too into like intricate details of why. And there is a molecular brain activity that when people watch sports, if you're really into sports, that it's almost like I wish people would move beyond and use that power. But there are a lot of people who don't know really dick about anything, but they know ins and outs of any sport, what you should do in this thing. Like the average sports call or to a sports show, other than the real ranty guys, are talking at a much higher, that guys and women are talking at a much higher level about the thing they're watching than just somebody who, mainlines a certain political thing. And it's a sort of a fascinating thing that's in your book. You just don't think about how much is going on when you watch a game and try to game plan. And then you add in fantasy, you talk about that adds another level of people really getting to know this thing that they love in a way that I've never tried to play the saxophone because of Clarence Clemens,
Right. And I think you're right. And a couple of things have changed that have made watching sports more of a mental exercise. When I was a kid, I'm a Mets fan. I grew up in Queens, not far from Shea Stadium, right? So my dad would take me to games and taught me how to score. But back then, like all you needed to know was ERA, RBI, a couple of really basic stats.
Yeah, counting.
And then Moneyball comes along, right? And suddenly there's all these crazy stats that I don't even, 8-letter acronyms. And if you want to play fantasy baseball and be successful, or you have to really understand that it's become much more complicated and math oriented. And then you mentioned the rise of sports radio, which didn't exist at some point and now does. And that's created this whole nation of Monday morning quarterbacks. And in order to do that, to call in, like you said, competently, explain in detail why the coach was an idiot and made the wrong decision, you have to understand the offense and the defense and the formations. And, like a lot of people over the pandemic, I watched that Last Dance documentary, and I could never understand like the triangle. I don't watch a lot of basketball, but until like they diagrammed it on the show for the players, I was like, oh yeah, I get it now. And it's super complicated.
Yeah. But it's also, there's something about that though, that I think is like, that is another thing that sort of, that the book connected for me, that I think I'd probably always sort of understood or suspected, is that like, if you care about this stuff, it's very natural and very human to want to learn more about it. It's like, it's fun. If you know a little bit, you want to know everything. And that like, as there is more to learn, I think that like, I don't, I write about baseball. Like I think about baseball a lot. I don't understand any of the sort of sabermetric stuff at a very high level beyond, like I can identify, like, I know if like 100 is a league average, thing for some of the advanced stats. Like I can tell if a number is more or less than 100, like not to brag, but the other stuff in there is like, I think that like that idea of wanting to sort of like improve your understanding of something just for the sake of your own pleasure and for your own sort of edification, beyond whether you want to win in fantasy or not, is like really not especially widely available elsewhere in the culture. Like it's not the sort of thing that like you can do it, but like this is one of the easiest ways to learn something as an adult, or or just as an interested layperson. And I think I hadn't really thought about how universal the wish to do that was. That like I think that is like one of the things that makes people human. It's just like not something that is especially well served in the marketplace at the moment.
Well, the only other thing I could think that I dabbled in a bit, but it's not really my thing, is I did do there was a Roger Ebert had a thing once to like watch Citizen Kane. He used to teach a class on Citizen Kane, and at one point he had I can't remember if it was online or it was a DVD, and basically he explained shot by shot why this movie matters. And I just wanted to understand better the movie, even though, and I think I got through it. And it was sort of this knowledge that's like, okay, I understand this movie better. I will never talk to anybody as long as I live about this.
Right.
And I know there are I'm sure there are diehard cinematography blog. If you can go down any rabbit hole if you want to find your people and you're that hardcore. But sports is the one place where it's like kind of in the middle. I know enough about pitching, not a ton, but enough to have a conversation. But I could talk to somebody who knows almost nothing, or somebody who knows why you throw this pitch then there, et cetera. And you're right. There's no other medium that has that. I guess maybe if you're into guitars, but I don't know anything about guitars.
There's nothing as socially acceptable as sports. Yeah. That like, if like guitar guys talk to each other. I mean, I have like one of my coworkers is like a guy he collects tube amps. He's a guitar player and he's got like friends that he talks to about tube amps, but like not around normal people. Like that's something they do.
Not somebody he sat next to in the airport, as Larry says. And you're right about that. The airport, it's the only thing to talk about.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, my whole thing as journalists, all my books have all been about the sort of I gravitate to topics that hide in plain sight, right? Sports is huge. There's 200 million sports fans, but nobody really ever thinks about them. And so every one of these little angles that's uncovered is like, yeah, oh, that makes sense, but I hadn't really thought of it. And that, kind of keeps coming up. And I think you're right in that, you can talk to anyone about sports. And if you don't know anything about the sport they're interested in, they're more than happy to explain it to you. You might not be getting a really good explanation, right. but that's why, I can, I'm overseas and I look at the snooker game and I don't know anything about it, but the person at the pub is really happy to explain to me everything that's going on the snooker table. So,
well, and unless you come across a real asshole, you can also bust balls. Like bust balls of a Trump supporter. I don't want to be anywhere near you if that's what you want to talk about, but an LSU and an Alabama guy, unless you're the worst of the worst, even a snoot full of beer you can have fun with that. And that's also a rarity.
But I mean, like one of the things, all these things, I was like, wow, I never thought about it that way. And one of them was sports bars itself, right? Like you said, there's no such thing as a tube amp bar. There's no such thing as an opera bar or a science fiction bar. Or
maybe in Japan. Maybe in Japan.
But we've it's become so widely accepted, thousands of sports bars around the world, that we don't ever stop to think like, wow, that's unique. There's no other. I mean, the only other venue like that would be a live music bar, like jazz club kind of thing. But typically those are only open at night. Or they're only, they're for performances.
You're there to listen, separately at your, in your space or at your table or whatever.
So I just find the very fact that sports bars exist and that nobody ever thinks about that fascinating.
Yeah, I guess it's because it's so normal that it's just like it's the it's the water you're swimming in, right? So it's like this is like one of the few things in the culture that it seems like is mostly there to make people happy, and that does give them that option to sort of improve themselves, but also that's like normal, I think, in a way that you could make the case that there's excesses and stuff, but it's normal in a way that doesn't hurt or doesn't narrow things. I think that's really an interesting thing to sort of bear in mind. Patrick, I cut you off though, dude.
I was going to say, you mentioned Kettle of Fish. I used to live down the street, and that now it's an insane thing where there's hundreds of people and you need tickets and blah, blah, blah. But when it opened, I was there not long after, and it was a place that started for Packers fans. And it's just sort of it's not a sports bar in the Midtown sense of like a million games, but it became a refuge in New York City. And what's interesting is you kind of point out how if it's not a sports bar, you have a great chapter on Middle East soccer. And it's just sort of the thing going on that it's not hard to root for a thing. You can root for it very deeply or not. And it does really seem to cross cultures across the world. I mean, it is a thing, and it moves the social needle forward, which is the part I was probably most cynical about when I started reading it. But you have chapter after chapter after chapter. And I want to read the quote that you wrote, because you have this great chapter on soccer in the Middle East and how it's getting a little more progressive. It's not changing everything, but you said, bottom line is that passion for sports makes things better, and better is much better than nothing. And I was like, that's true.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of times it's baby steps, or in the case of the Middle East, one step forward, two step back kind of thing. But that's one of the things is I think when she did the introduction, she said, great for a gift for fans or anybody who knows a sports fan. And I know that if you're a sports fan and you read this book, you're going to find something in there you like or relate to, or that kind of common memory of childhood, whatever it is. But I think the important thing is for non-sports fans to realize that they live in a better world that is more tolerant, peaceful, progressive, because of sports fans who they often look down on. So, that's a message. I'd love for like somebody who's just like, yeah, sports is a waste of time, to read this book and then rethink their perspective.
I'm going to go around just saying you're welcome to people in an aggrieved tone.
Well, we should add
my Tsuyoshi Shinjo jersey. Be like, I did this for you.
We should add too, you write it as an interesting back and forth with a doctor friend of yours who claimed not to be a sports fan. It turned out at one point she was, but that has that nice little setup too. It's not a, this is one reason that our sports fans are good, and this is another. It's this nice little back and forth conversation where you drop in a bunch of interesting facts. And we should just lay it out there again. Sports fans are in better shape. That was a bit of a surprise, not gonna lie.
Yeah, especially just given that Patrick and I are not in great physical shape.
Well,
but go ahead.
That one's a little like with the mental health. It's clear to me that being a sports fan makes a lot of people happier. The physical health one is trickier. It's clear that sports fans are more active than non-fans, but it's not clear why. It's sort of a chicken and an egg thing. A lot of people might be sports fans because they were active. They played Little League, they played soccer, they were into sports, so they're sports fans. So it's a question of like which causes the other. And so I wanted to see if there was any evidence. We live in a society that has an obesity epidemic and a lot of health-related issues. So again, with that, a little better is better than nothing logic, I wanted to see if there were examples where spectator sports could transform sedentary people into active people. And there definitely are examples, which I, kind of elaborate at length. And it's not everyone. It's like, I like NFL football and I never watch a game and say like, I'm going to go buy a helmet and go out in the street and have somebody knock me down, right? There's no real upside in that. But that does happen with some sports. And, Lance Armstrong, a lot of people took up cycling because of seeing Lance Armstrong.
And now every suburban dad owns a Tour de France outfit.
Yep. Exactly. And a bike that costs more than like a used car. Golf is another example, and I explained sort of the history of how, I'm of the opinion that if at a very particular time, a perfect storm of circumstances had it sort of mesmerized the American public, golf would be as popular as dressage or yacht racing today. And that's, a sport people participate in heartily. And the Olympics, which, there's a lot of sort of negativity right now around the Tokyo Olympics, and there's a lot of issues with continuing it. But one of the things that nobody is talking about is sort of the public health benefits of the Olympics. And every time the Olympics come around, people join health. It's like a self-fulfilling New Year's resolution. It makes people want to get in shape, and the numbers are there. And, the Olympics in a certainly non-pandemic time are good for spectators. So, it's not the kind of panacea it is for some of the other things, but it helps some people. And I think, and American Ninja Warrior as well. I
was about to say, why don't you two go ahead? I'll be over here.
Well, the thing is, I liked American Ninja Warrior already. I found the show fascinating. But when I started to look at this, what they call the participation effect of watching a sport getting people in, to me, there's no clearer example, because it's a sport that was made up out of whole cloth.
Yeah.
It didn't exist before. And now there are hundreds of ninja training gyms across the country. And not only kids go to them, it's also very multi-generational. You watch the show, right? You see these parents be like, my kid dragged me there, or I dragged my kid there.
Yeah.
And they train
part of
together.
the story that they sell. Yeah.
And they would not, this is, there's no clear logic. These people would not be going to this gym and working out had they not watched this sport on TV.
Yeah, it's very consciously. I think it is good in that way. I was thinking about that Olympic comparison when you were making it too, because it's, to a certain extent, I think the Olympics are, the sports that are featured there that like people think about every 4 years and hardly ever otherwise, that like, it might be that some people like watch Simone Biles and are like, that's cool, I want to learn to do that, I'm going to go to a gym. But like, it's not going to happen for you. Like, it's Simone Biles. She's like a, demigod, right?
Yeah.
But with like American Ninja Warrior, that's like the part of it that like the inspiration element of the Olympics. It's like the sort of the little interstitial bits with Bob Costas narrating or whatever, that like, all of that is in American Ninja Warrior, sometimes more or less effectively, but it's about like a teacher or, you know, like a plumber or like forgetting his name now. I want to say it's, oh boy, the big cat dude, the guy that's like HVAC repairman guy that's like 6'7" or whatever. That like any of that stuff, it's just that idea of normal people containing this sort of like heroic capacity or whatever. Like it's the oldest story there is. It's like the story that people love the most.
And they get I mean, there's a lot of cool things about it, but they get professional athletes, former Olympians to come on. You know, you've seen the NFL players, a lot of Olympic gymnasts and divers, and they almost don't totally fall on their face, right?
Yeah.
So the HVAC repairman in this venue runs circles around them.
Right. Yeah. Like, sorry, like has Kamarian Wembley beat. That's just how it is. That was, although Cam Wembley did do pretty well last season. Nice to remember a guy there. There's one little bit before we do video and Q&A stuff I want to ask about that I thought the chapter about how sports can be sort of like a nexus for civic healing. And,
actually,
do you have an actual question written down on it? Go ahead.
No, I don't. We don't have a question, but I wrote down that I thought that chapter was amazing. This phrase, I believe, came from a Detroit columnist, and he called them municipal myths in the way that he meant actual mythology that magic happens. And you have a great stretch in the book because you have Piazza's 9/11 home run. I was here. You know, Dave was either here or connected to here, and it meant a huge. It meant a huge thing. And every time I see it, I get teared up. But the thing that you put in there that I'm not a hockey guy, so I didn't ever put together the Las Vegas Golden Knights and that terrible shooting and how much that meant to that town. And that phrase, municipal myths, will stick with me because it is kind of true. It seems trite in some ways when you just on the surface, but it's actually one of the things where you dig a little deeper, like, yeah, there's something to that, just beyond rooting for a team that makes your community happy. Like when there's certain times it really does matter.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up because this is actually personally my favorite part of the book, this chapter.
I think it's my favorite chapter in the book too.
And I, you know, I not only was a Mets fan, but when I was in high school, I worked in World Trade Center, right? So I vividly remember the Mike Piazza thing. But at the time, like 9/11 itself, that struck me as like an anomaly. But researching this book, I found that no, it's not. Sports does this over and over and over on natural and man-made disasters, the Boston Marathon bombing, hurricanes, all around the world. But the thing with Las Vegas is that it was current enough. I was writing the book, and I've spent more time in Las Vegas than any city I haven't lived in. I've been there like 50 plus times. I've written a ton on Las Vegas. I was able to go out there and interview people who had been shot at. I interviewed the mayor. I interviewed Golden Knights executives. I interviewed cab drivers and bartenders. And everyone I talked to was so moved. I mean, when a woman who was afraid to leave her home after the shooting, right? And in therapy and basically healed by the Golden Knights. And it's a great story. I won't go into it now because it's a little bit too long for this. But basically, that's the moment. That was my aha moment in this book when I was like, you can't dismiss this sports fandom as trivial or trite because it like saved these people. And that's really important. And it's going to happen again and again. And I think even just as we come out of the pandemic, you're going to see the same kind of, you know, community when you can go. That's the whole thing is when there's any kind of a traumatic event, people kind of go into this lockdown phase. They're afraid to go out, whatever. And then when they're ready, what they want to do is get back into it with people and celebrate and share. And, you know, our sports stadiums are bigger than our biggest synagogues, mosques, churches. And when you can go back to Shea Stadium at 100% occupancy and high five the stranger next to you without worrying about getting sick, that's when the normalcy of post-COVID will have returned.
Yeah, that's where I was going with that. There's a lovely quote from the late Jennifer Fry, which that after this is, you know, after September 11th, but tonight there will be a reason to sit next to strangers and feel connected by something other than fear and horror and sadness. And obviously, contextually, it's easy to sort of plug that in there, but it is also like not just, I think, the thing that I'm looking forward to about going back to a ball game when I'm inoculated and comfortable and, you know, able to get tickets and stuff. But I think that like as real as the effects are, as you're able to document it, like at a human level, this sort of again like reminded me of how impoverished some of the broader space for that sort of connection is anywhere else in the culture around any other thing, like beyond like obviously like religion has played that role, I think, in, you know, a declining way in recent generations for, you know, I would argue for worse, but I mean like for better or for worse. But this, I mean, this is like a theme that sort of keeps coming back through the book, that people need to be with each other. They need to be near each other, and they need to feel safe and happy and like a part of a bigger whole. And I think that it's very convincing, and I think like important to recognize how sports does that. But there is also like, I mean, I just kept thinking about like, what about the people that don't do this? Like, where do they go, and what can they do? And there's something I don't know to what extent this ever is going to resolve into a question, so I'm just going to stop talking. But there is like, I don't know. I found that much more moving. I think, again, it's something I sort of understood, but didn't really think about that much.
Well, I don't think on a conscience level, you necessarily think about fandom in terms of bigger pictures. I mean, just in terms of, you know, and well, actually, this is going to come full circle in a hurry because I want to show the clip. We actually don't have any questions. We don't have that many attendees. If you want to ask a question, you will get it on. If not, we'll just keep going till it ends. But so there was the parts about 9/11 and the Golden Knights and these big things, but then there was also the story of the Broncos family. I believe the mother had cancer, and she just took a lot of inspiration from, I think, also football, waiting for the game every Sunday, you know, doing her chemo. The family rallied around her, and they have season tickets. And I was reading this book today, and as people who watch this show know, Larry, you don't, but both my parents died this year. And growing up in Billings, they took me to a lot of Mustangs games. That was our thing. We had little season tickets. And then, unfortunately, like a month ago, a high school buddy of mine died. And another mutual friend, people I grew up with, was the assistant general manager for the Mustangs for a couple of years. And this is why I'm wearing a Mustangs jersey. He got married on the field. I ran on like Manny Ramirez or Sammy Sosa. But it just happens. It so happened today, this afternoon, while I was reading that, my friend put up a GoFundMe because they want to buy my friend Daryl. That's the guy who died. My friend Matt used to be the GM. They want to buy him a tile at the minor league stadium. You can buy a tile. It's $1,000. You get it engraved, and they want to put his name there. And the GoFundMe is just for that. His parents were like, we don't want money for anything, but if you want to do something, so we're GoFunding this memorial for my friend. And I just happened to come. The email came to me while I was reading that chapter, and I was really taken aback by, like, I've never once in my life thought about what going to Mustang games meant other than it was a fun thing in Billings, right? I went with my family when I was a kid. Then we drank beers in the parking lot with these guys, ran on the field late at night sometimes. But it's kind of the same thing you were talking about with the other things. I had never even considered it. This is a through line of a life, and these fandoms, that's what they are. And I think that's just something I don't really, for as much time as I think and write about sports and all that, I don't know, Dave, do you think about these things in that way? I just guess I don't really. And Piazza, the 9/11, sure, but that's the most extreme event that's ever been like. So I don't know. I just thought that maybe hitting today was bigger than that, whatever, but it was really sort of shocking that I was like, oh yeah, this is a chunk of my life.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think so much of what I write about, it goes back to that, like, who cares about the fans? Like, the players are the show here. And yet, like, you know, that's just obviously not true. Like, they're part of the show. But I mean, that's what Larry was saying about the idea of, like, when you're watching a game on television, you're watching a stadium and you're watching people that, like, I mean, I think that's why baseball felt wrong last year, was that, like, it didn't sound right. It didn't look right. It didn't feel right. And it was that there weren't, you know, half the show is missing, like the part of it that, like, sort of that is more identifiably human, I guess, was maybe just absent.
Yeah, and I think, in the pandemic, sports coming back without fans was more important than having the fans. But what we learned is that long term, it's not sustainable. It's not as much fun to watch the sports in an empty stadium. But it's interesting that the Broncos family, when I spoke to the daughter, at the end of all these stories, her talking to her mom, and and then her being married, and them having all these tickets together, all the trials and tribulations, her grandfather having a rare disease. Like at the end of that, and there's a lot of kind of poignant quotes in the book. And, you talk about some of the 9/11 Jennifer Frey. I mean, my editor made me cut more from that chapter because I just had like 100 quotes like that.
She's the best writer too, man. She was so good.
But when that young woman said to me at the end, like, it's been great growing up Broncos. Like, it was so natural. It wasn't like a planned line. It was just like she was reflecting on all of this. And that was it. Like, that was like you said, the through story of her life. And I think that's pretty awesome.
That actually plays well into the question that we have in the Q&A, but we should do the video, Patrick.
We can do it. Let's do the video last. It's very short. I'll read the question from Andrew Pregler. Are there any differences between fans who are born into fandom versus those who choose? I say this as a Yinzer, Pittsburgh by birth, who has adopted the Nets after living in Brooklyn, and it definitely feels different. I wasn't born into any of my fandoms, so it's all been a choice for me. I can't.
Even the Philly shit? I thought that was like
kind of, but it was like, I mean, it was still I was still raised in Montana.
Right.
It wasn't like I wasn't around. It was just me and my brothers,
Yeah. So, I mean, very few people, I would say very few people choose. And it's, the top two reasons why people are a certain religion or fans of a certain team are the same, which is where you're born and what your parents believed. And the difference being that, there are religions everywhere. There are gaps in the country where there's like no major teams in certain sports. And there's anomalies, like you mentioned the Braves before, when TBS was created, that was at like the heyday of when there were all these local blackouts and weird broadcast rules.
Yeah.
So the Braves suddenly became the first team in professional sport that you could watch anywhere in the country for free. So they got a lot of fans in random places where you live far enough away from your closest major leagues. So Braves had this weird saturation.
And I was one of them as a Mets fan. Like before that rivalry even happened, like just it was free baseball that I could watch on TV. And
that was also why in the radio days the Cardinals were the biggest, because they had all the radio feeds west of the Mississippi.
But the question from the viewer, what I would say is that's when you get the choice, and it's not a choice. It's because you relocated, right? You live in Pittsburgh now, or I forget.
Other way around.
Way around. He lives in New York now, so the Nets. Like I have a friend from New Hampshire who's a really big Patriots fan, tattoo, the whole 9 yards, moved to Seattle 20 years ago, still lives in Seattle, Seahawks fan. But if the Seahawks and the Patriots played, he would be rooting for the Patriots. So that's what I would posit. Obviously the Nets and the Steelers are not going to play, or it would be a really good game if they did, but it's probably not going to happen. But where is the real allegiance is the question.
But you don't mention this in the book, but one thing that always drives me crazy is like diehards. I've been there forever who are against bandwagoners. Being in a town where a team gets really good all of a sudden, like, that's fun as hell. Like I was, even if you're not a thing, that's the other side of the civic, like deep, whatever. Just, hey, all of a sudden our team's good. Woo!
Yeah, like how
it's fun. It's more fun than if it's just bad and it's only miserable people watching a shitty.
I think that's 100. I mean, I think the most fun I've had as a sports fan living in New York, give or take the 2015 second half for the Mets, was Linsanity. And I'm not a Knicks fan. I never.
Yeah, it was great. I'm not a Knicks fan either, but it was great.
And it was like people that I didn't even like, friends I have that don't even really care about basketball that much were like, where are we watching the game tonight? And I was like, we like, but it was just like people, like some cool thing was happening that could clearly stop at any time. And so, yeah, like you get together and you be around other people to be a part of it. Like that's, with all of this stuff is I kept having the same response to the book. Like, how are you surprised by this? And yet I was like, no, reliably.
I 100% agree. I was like, oh yeah, well, that's true. I knew that, but I don't know. I guess thinking of fandom, you just instantly go to my brain just goes to kind of, not even necessarily the worst of the worst, like the drunkest, yellingest guy, but just like so much boorish behavior. And I should add that a lot of this is sort of, you ask a female sports writer on social media, but that's anonymous bullshit. Like that's not, but it's also, again, not most sports fans. It's not most sports fans.
It definitely can be like an organizing framework for people to be their worst selves. I think that like going to games, like that type of discourse, like using it as a way to like be a part of some like stupid mob or whatever, like it's all there. And yet like, I think that it's also like, it's value neutral. Like it's what you choose to do with it. Some people like get that sense of being together. And then some people get that sense of like being together, chasing someone down the street.
But Larry, I want to say you just, for a book I picked up kind of expecting one thing. I thought it was going to be sort of a, did you ever read the book? I just bring this up because I think of it, the Steve Almond book, Against Football. I thought it was very much going to be that, like, I'm going to prove to you why sports fans are great. And it was not that. It's like, here's this and this and this. Like, oh, that made me think of that. This. I should add, there's one other thing about sports fandom that we should acknowledge. Chelsea, can you play the clip? There is also, and this is for you, Daryl, Billings Mustangs, 2015, Zach Shields. This is the other part of being a sports fan.
The Zach Shields footage.
That's good.
Getting to see something cool is definitely an.
Yes, there's also the superhuman element.
That guy should go on American Ninja Warrior.
Yeah, he's got the length. I can see it.
It looks like
John Alexis Jr. body type that you look for.
His minor league career looks like it's coming to an end. So, Zach, if you're watching, I'm sure you're not, but somebody will send it to you.
I can't tell you how nice it is to talk to another adult American Ninja Warrior fan, just on a personal level. It's like me and my wife and my sister and her husband, and it's like a thing that we can only talk about with each other. Like it's
I somehow knew that about you, and I've never seen the show.
I've written about it a bunch, man. I wrote some. I think
I'm guaranteed I never read. I never read one of those articles.
Yeah,
you mentioned it on a podcast or a tweet.
Yeah, all right, that's fair. Something short.
So, Larry, I think the one thing I wanted to wrap up real quick, you are not a big sports fan, or at least when you wrote the book, you said you tune into some NFL games. You're obviously active outside of that, but has it made you want to be more of a fan of teams? Or has it made you more interested, or are you basically where you started, except maybe you think we're a better class of people than you thought before?
No, I think it's made me more interested in the sports. So NFL football is sort of my primary fan sport. And certainly in the pandemic, I watched a lot more of it than I usually do. But to me, it's made me more appreciative of any good game, right? So if I look and like the Chiefs are playing the Packers, I'm going to watch that game, even though my Buffalo Bills aren't in it. And I might not care who wins, but it's definitely made me like more appreciative of the sport and less gung-ho about the teams. That being said, Buffalo Bills did have a pretty awesome season.
Yeah, they're right there.
We're out of time, so I won't get to find out why someone who grew up right next to Shea Stadium somehow became a Bills fan. But
it's because when they became New York's only professional football team.
You love OJ, admit it.
Now, at the time I grew up, New Jersey was not cool like it is now. So the idea of my team leaving Queens for New Jersey was like a big slap in the face.
I guess that makes some sense.
And I think, looking at the Jets now, I came out ahead.
Right. I was going to say, you saved yourself. This book would never have been written. You would never have thought this is making me better and happier if you had stayed with the Jets.
All right. We have 1 minute left. I have to get to, first of all, this book is super fun, and I actually think a pretty good conversation starter for Mother's Day, Father's Day. It'll for the sports fan of your life, but you also make them feel better about themselves.
Also fits in the pocket.
It does, and it fits in your pocket. You put it inside like a reporter's notebook.
Yeah.
Our next book for June, it's June 28th. We're off for a while, but it's going to check both of our boxes for Father's Day and Pride Month. It is All the Colors Came Out, A Father, a Daughter, A Lifetime of Lessons from Kate Fagan, who played Colorado. Then she wrote for ESPN, Philadelphia Inquirer. She's now at Sports Illustrated. And it's a story of how her and her father grew up Knicks fans, had some kind of falling out, and then he got ALS, and then the Knicks brought them back together. Your New York Knicks, your, not mine, but whoever's New York Knicks, our playoff bound New York Knicks. Thanks a lot, Larry. This book is it's one of the few books I would tell anybody to read, no matter what sport you like, because there's a lot of interesting research, and it's a lot of surprising stuff in there, and you'll feel better about yourself. And Daryl, take us out, Chelsea.
Thanks, man.
Thanks so much, Patrick, David, and Larry, for such an excellent conversation tonight. As Patrick mentioned, you can buy tonight's featured book, Fans, at Greenlight Bookstore, and also our June featured book, All the Colors Came Out. You can find the links to both of those book buy pages in the chat if you open that up. And you can also shop, if you're local to Brooklyn, in store at Greenlight, noon to 7 any day of the week. If you missed any part of tonight's event, or if you just want to indulge in a rewatch, keep an eye out on our YouTube channel, Greenlight Bookstore. It'll be up there in the next few days. And registration for the June installment will be open late next week. So keep an eye on greenlightbookstore.com/event for when that's up. Thank you so much, everyone, for a great evening, and have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thanks.
Bye. See ya.